Hey there, it's Michelle Caruana from Play Cafe Academy and Profitable Play. And I know we are still several weeks away from the holiday gifting season, but as you are planning out your retail sales and promotions this year, I wanted to make you aware of just one more thing because it's really important. And that is vendor selection and retail toy safety. And this video and this conversation in general is especially important if you work with small toy brands, local creators and makers, or if you're making anything in-house for sale, like sensory bins, Play-Doh kits, anything like that. Because we want to make sure that you are protecting yourself from risk and liability as a retailer. And we also want to make sure that you are delivering an excellent experience to all of your customers that is consistent with what you want for yourself as a brand and for your reputation. So to talk about this topic, I am bringing back a fan favorite guest from an earlier video on this channel, Azhelle Wade, AKA the Toy Coach. And she is going to walk through her step-by-step process on how she recommends vetting vendors, ensuring all safety compliances, and really making sure, again, you're delivering that excellent customer experience every single time, and to make sure that everyone has a safe and profitable holiday season this year. Now, Azhelle is going to get into a lot of details in this video. So she's going to give you acronyms, she's going to give you websites, she's going to give you resources to look up. So don't worry if you're not in a place where you can take notes right now, if you're cleaning or if you're driving or anything like that. I've linked everything in the video description so you have easy access to it, including Azhelle's toy safety bundle that she's going to talk about towards the end of this video. But this video is so informative and so important, again, if you sell any retail inventory in your shop or if you plan to. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Azhelle Wade, AKA the Toy Coach. Hi, Azhelle. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me back on the podcast and YouTube channel.
I'm very excited to have you back, and we're going to have a little bit of a different conversation today, one that I think is very much needed and very interesting, more interesting than I could have expected.
Yeah.
So before we dive into the good stuff, do you want to get started and reintroduce yourself and remind people who you are and who you serve?
Yeah, so my name is Azhelle Wade. I'm known in the toy industry as the Toy Coach, and I teach people how to develop their own toy products and launch them in the toy industry. Some people are signing licensing deals with toy companies, and other people are developing their own products and selling them to retailers or direct to consumers. I help people do all of that.
Awesome. And last conversation we had, which I will link in the show notes or the video description, whether you're watching or listening, we talked about how to bring a toy to market, how to form your idea and work with manufacturers and things like that. So if that's what someone is looking for, again, I'm going to link that. Today, we're actually talking about safety, and we're talking more to our indoor playground owners who want to make sure that they are stocking high quality, safe retail items.
Yeah.
So to kind of lead into this conversation, can you explain a little bit about why this is important?
Oh man. I mean, toy safety is important because if you care about your customers, then you want them to have a positive experience at your store or at your playground, and you don't want them leaving that space with something that could potentially harm them at home, and then thereby relating your store to the negative experience that they had with that product that they purchased from your store. So it's just important that you're aware of what the toy safety standards are, because as indoor playground owners, or if you're a specialty toy store owner, you're more likely to want to support those small startup toy companies, but you can't play around with the safety of the people that are coming into your store. Play around. You can't, pun intended, you can't play around with the safety of those coming into your store. So it's super important that you know what to look for when you're working with these small creators or small manufacturers.
So can you explain a little bit about the safety standards that we need to be aware of as retailers?
So the top three would be ASTM F963. That's basically the general toy safety standard. If you look at any toy in Walmart, Target, you flip over the box or you look at the bottom of the box, it's going to say conforms to ASTM F963. It covers, that safety standard covers so many aspects of toy safety, like mechanical safety, physical properties, flammability, toxicology like lead and phthalates. Every toy that passes that standard has gone through rigorous testing, dependent on the age that the toy is made for, and dependent on if the toy has batteries or if it has paint, etc. The CPSIA is the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. So that's something you should also just be aware of what it is. And that is the act that was passed that actually requires this testing and certification for toys. That's why we have to make sure that our toys meet certain standards. Then the last thing is something that I experienced a lot in my 14 plus year toy career because I focused heavily on arts and crafts when I was working full time in the toy industry. And that standard is called ASTM D4236. And that is a standard you'll only find on arts and crafts product. So like scrapbooks, paint sets, anything with glue and like paint and even pencils is a separate standard that focuses on like health hazards for art materials to make sure that those materials won't harm a kid if it like gets on their skin or in their mouth.
Yeah. So last conversation that we had, we talked a little bit about working with people that are new to the toy industry or maybe independent makers. Can you
Yeah.
share a little bit about working with those types of people who maybe are either going through that process or may
Yeah.
not have products that are up to that standard yet?
Well, no, they should. I mean, if in my program, Toy Creators Academy, I teach my students to meet the standards. So the first thing you should ask for is a children's product certificate. And you can also ask for supporting test reports from different testing labs that are CPSC certified, and that any mass manufacturing toy company should have. Now, there is a standard, like there is a way for small batch manufacturers to kind of get around that. So the Consumer Product Safety Commission has an option where if you're a small batch manufacturer, there's a certain dollar amount that you're not supposed to be making more than, and a certain number of units that you're not supposed to be selling more than. That will allow you to kind of have more leniency on some of the requirements for safety testing. You still have to meet all the safety standards, but the process of meeting them is a little bit more lenient. But in order for a manufacturer to qualify for that, they actually have to apply on the CPSC website. So we can put the link to that in the show notes, but that would be something you'd want to tell your small batch manufacturers, your small startup toy companies. Okay, I understand you don't have this large safety testing report, but first you need to get registered on this site as a small batch manufacturer, and then we can continue our conversation and have you in our store.
Awesome. And I know a lot of indoor playground owners, I've seen this a couple different times. They
Mm-hmm.
will want to make things like craft kits or sensory bins or Play-Doh kits. Those are the three I see most commonly in indoor playgrounds. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how we might be able to sell those safely and if we can just kind of put some stuff in a bin, put it on our shelves, or what the correct process might look like?
Don't do that. So when you do that, is that like buying things from like Temu, Alibaba, like Etsy, and putting it all together?
It could be, yeah. So let me give you an example. So we
Mm-hmm.
recently went to an indoor playground and they had sensory bins. They were in little tubs, ones that you would see at the dollar store. They were
Mm-hmm.
filled with things like crinkle paper and then, yes, some little smaller items from like Temu, maybe a rubber duck,
Mm-hmm.
maybe some little fidget toys, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're kind of combining all of these different pieces into, like I said, sensory bins. Sometimes there's kinetic sand kits is one I see commonly. Again, Play-Doh, which a lot of people will make at home and
Mm-hmm.
then sell on their shelves again, just for a little bit of extra money. But I've always wondered, what the correct
Interesting.
process would be for creating something like that. So do you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Yeah, so they might qualify, they probably qualify for the small batch manufacturer uh category. So there might be some leniency there. And again, we'll put the link to that in the show notes, but you really you don't want to do that because so if someone purchases a product from your store and they get harmed in some way and they want to report it, they would go to the same website, cpsc.gov, and they would report the item. But an item that's kind of made in that way won't have a UPC label. It won't really even have, it won't have a record. And there won't be a way to report it. And what I worry about two things. I worry, one, there's no way to track that item. Like say the sand itself, the Zand itself had mold, and there's no way to track where that batch came from to stop that batch, like to stop the big moldy batch that it might all be coming from. So that's one problem. But then two, when you sell toys, there's actually a separate insurance that you need to have, like manufacturing insurance. So if you run a brick and mortar store, I would assume you don't have that manufacturing insurance. And by selling a product like that, you're taking on just additional liability that you might not be insured for fully. So that would be my worry. Um, but then, so like the alternative to that, obviously, is to look for just toy manufacturers that create that. But what I don't want you to do is go to like Temu or Alibaba or just go to Etsy, because like there are three different reasons, like Temu being the worst. There was actually a report with the LA Times that Temu has been linked to forced labor in China. So they clearly, or they're reportedly not practicing ethical, work environments, and they may not be concerned with safety concerns. There's been reports of clothing having toxic chemicals in it, so who knows what's happening with the toys. So if you're thinking like, well, maybe I'll just create it from a factory in Temu, like that might not be a good option either. And then Alibaba, you might say, okay, well, maybe I'll go the next step up. I'll go to like something like Alibaba, because that is essentially getting it factory direct and shipping it here. Maybe that'll be okay. But Alibaba has like thousands of factories. And even when you go on that site, you have to vet the suppliers there. And if you don't know what to look for, I mean, you're just not going to be able to vet their product. And you might say, well, there's like thousands of factories in Alibaba. I can look through their certifications. I can figure it out. I can pick one. But what's interesting is like the toy industry is actually so small. And I find that the factories that are producing most of the toys are so many of the same factories. Like my students use factories that have produced toys, Squishmallows toys, which is a huge brand. The fact that the same factory is producing a Squishmallows brand and a startup tiny plush toy company's brand. There really aren't as many ethical, reputable, super safe, and compliant toy factories as you might think. So I wouldn't rush to assume that if you found somebody on Alibaba and what you think is like a certification that's legit is legit, it might not be. There's actually a huge black market for like ISO 9001 certifications, which is like a factory standard certification. And then if you go to Etsy, that may be a better option. But again, Etsy might have people who are like hand making goods, and they might fall under that category of like small batch manufacturers, and thereby have certain like testing relief from the CPSC. But you still have to make sure that they're registered on the site. So I would say Etsy or Amazon if you're buying wholesale from another vendor, or I'll introduce a new option, a Fair. Fair.com is a great option for stores that want to order wholesale from smaller toy companies. But regardless, if you choose any of those places, you want to make sure that they've done the proper legwork. And if there are any issues with the product, that they have the right certifications, they have the right protections in place, and that's not going to fall on you and your business.
Absolutely. And anyone that has opened an indoor playground has, none of this should be new to them, because we actually go through
Right.
the same issues, especially with Alibaba, when we're looking for indoor playground equipment, because a
Oh,
lot of my students have gotten burned by, like you said, not vetting the suppliers enough. A lot of things get hung up in customs because they're lacking the proper certifications and things
yeah.
like that. So it sounds like it's a very similar process.
Yes.
And like you said, a lot of people group them all into one category, but in reality, there are thousands of sellers on there, and you have to specifically vet each one. Just because
Yeah.
you've had a great experience with one vendor doesn't mean you're going to be able to replicate that with another. So I'm
Right.
so glad that you brought that up, because that's something
Yeah.
actually that I talk about in my program. And one of the reasons I cautioned against getting equipment from those places for that reason, just because there's so much risk. Because some of
Mm-hmm.
those pieces are, 40, $50,000 plus. So these are big investments.
Yeah,
So it's interesting that with these smaller inventory investments, we have to have those same concerns, but it makes perfect
that
sense.
is interesting. Huh.
So that's a big mistake that I see a lot of people make. So I'm so glad that we got to get into it. Are there any
Yeah.
other mistakes that you commonly see in retailers when they go to select vendors for their toy sections?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say it's a mistake because I just feel like there isn't a lot of education on this, which is why we're going to be launching our safety bundle, so you can grab that, and I'll give you the link so you can put it in the show notes. But I what I would recommend doing is having a checklist for whenever you bring in a new vendor that you can go through to just ask yourself these key questions. Most toy store owners don't have to do this because most of them work with vendors that are already set up in their system. They don't often work with new vendors. So it's not that they don't have to do it, it's just that they've done it in the past. So when I worked full time for Toys R Us, we had a 6 month vendor setup process. And that vendor setup process involved certifications. And it was just like an intrinsic part of the process of onboarding a new vendor that we didn't even think about. It was just something we had to do. But now in my new world, working as a toy coach, working with smaller retailers and smaller manufacturers, I see that there is no standard for how do we vet the products that come in, and people are just kind of taking this risk. But the things that I would ask you to ask for is, one, you can ask for a children's product certificate. You can ask the manufacturer, the small batch manufacturer, for that. They may or may not know what that is. It depends on, how much experience they actually have. And if they don't know what it is, I would recommend giving them the link that we'll put in the show notes to apply to be listed as a small batch manufacturer under the CPSC. You want to verify that the product conforms to ASTM F963 if it's a standard toy. And if it includes like any art materials like pencils, glue, what am I, markers, then you want it to also fall under the standard of ASTM D4236. And both in order to know if it passes both of those standards, what you would ask is for a safety report. So every toy that gets developed is then supposed to be sent for safety testing. And there are approved labs that are approved by the CPSC for safety testing, for toy safety testing. Some of the key labs used in the toy industry are like SGS, Intertech, BV, UL, I've seen, and Eurovision. So you can ask a manufacturer, I'd like to see the safety test report for this product, and they can send you that safety test report. And that safety test report is going to have an image of the product at the very bottom, but it's going to have descriptions of all of the tests that were run. There'll be drop tests, there might be choking tube tests. Depending on what the product is, there's going to be a different variety of tests, and it'll tell you like if it passed all of those tests. So, I mean, that is probably the easiest thing you could do, is ask for that. And then there is a certification called the ICTI Ethical Toy Program. So this is a separate certification that factories get to make sure that their factories are run ethically. So you could ask your manufacturer, like, hey, what factory did you use to produce this product? One, send me the safety certification from whatever lab did the safety testing. And two, send me the ICTI certificate for the factory that produced the product. So that just certifies the factory itself meets high standards of labor practices and environmental responsibility. Not every factory is going to have that, but it's just like, it's an extra layer. You can decide how like rigid of a retailer you want to be, how high of standards you want to hold, and then you could use that to tell your customers, like, we only carry the best of the best. These are the standards our vendors have to live up to, and you might use that as a little bit of like your marketing for your brand.
Absolutely. One question that I wanted to ask, because this is something, again, that's really common in our industry, is a lot of times we'll have retail shelves, yes,
Mm-hmm.
which that was a great description
Yeah.
for that type of thing. But we also will a lot of times do vendor events where we're utilizing like short-term
Mm.
vendors. Is this also something that you would recommend doing whenever we do, again, sort of like a pop-up retail shop?
I mean, yeah. Where, so, well, give me a vision of these pop-up retail shops. What happens?
Yeah. So, for example, a lot of people will do one around Mother's Day and
Uh-huh.
holidays. They'll reach out to everyone in the community and say, hey, if you have anything you want to sell, some of them will be, kind of multi level marketing, which I recommend staying away from. Some of them
Mm-hmm.
will be, all different retailers. Some will be candle makers, some will be,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, that type of thing. But a lot of them will sell children's products just because that's who we tend to attract as family friendly businesses.
Right.
So I was just curious if we should really be doing this entire vetting process, especially when it comes to what you were speaking about and the liability and the potential insurance issues that can come about. I'm assuming that, the answer is we always should be vetting our vendors, but it probably matters a little bit less, but you probably still
Right.
recommend it.
Well, what I would say, this is not legal advice, but from the perspective, what I can see is happening is you're holding an event where other vendors are coming and selling their goods. So they're selling to the consumer. So that safety responsibility really seems to fall on them as they're selling the product. The issue comes when you, as a retailer, are purchasing a product from someone else. And now that is your product that you are reselling. And we've seen it with, I think, like the water beads. Water beads were like super popular, those beads that like
Yes.
they touch water, they grow like 10 times, and they're a massive choking hazard. um so once that happened, once that became alerted, then it's like everyone is at risk. Like the person who sold the product, the person who manufactured the product, everyone wants to pull that product from the shelves. So from the shelves. So I just think you want to be very stringent when you're going to be reselling the product, because that's you taking on some of that responsibility.
And it's funny you bring that up, because there's also a situation pretty frequently in our industry where
Yeah.
business owners, instead of purchasing inventory, they will run out shelf space, and the vendors
Oh.
will then kind of stock their own items. People pay via QR code or
Hmm.
payment link, so no money actually passes through the indoor playground business. It's all
Oh,
done from the vendor
interesting.
perspective. So I completely understand what you're saying, that that's a way to kind of take some of the liability off of us as the indoor
Yeah.
playground owner. But I also am curious, to the end consumer, are they going to be splitting those hairs? If something major does happen,
Yeah.
even if you are not technically liable, people are still going to view you as partially responsible. And that's still
Yeah.
your brand and your business that you're putting on the line. So you
Hmm.
kind of have to take all of those different factors into account.
That is so, honestly, if I were in that situation, I would be reaching out to my lawyer to get clarification. I would be saying, okay, I want to rent out this shelf space and allow people to sell via QR code in my space. What signage do I need to have around it to make it crystal clear that this is a separate entity? I would be asking my lawyer those questions.
Absolutely. It's just so interesting, all of the different ways that we have to sell
Yeah.
retail items these days.
Yeah.
It's a tricky game, but again, when it comes to your brand and your reputation, in my opinion, you want to be as careful as possible. So even if you're utilizing vendors in that
Yeah.
way, it's still at least good to be stringent and ask about their legitimacy, about their certifications and things like that, because they're still going to be in your space. Even if people are paying via QR code, they're still going to
Yeah.
associate your indoor playground with that purchase. So I like the idea of still, especially if you're locking yourself into a long-term relationship with this vendor.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
for example, a lot of people will run out the shelf space for like a year or a 2-year agreement. So
Yes. Yes. Yes.
if you're going to be locking yourself into that long of a contract, you might as well, just maintain their records on hand so you have them so you can feel more comfortable.
And I also want to say, like, the laws are in place for a reason. So when your product passes those safety tests, there is just less risk for the consumer. And then there's also less risk for the consumer to have space to come back at the company. It's like it's passed these certain laws and it wasn't meant to be used that way. So I just, Yeah, I mean, it's not something to really be afraid of. It's just something to look at. Oh, of course I'll do this one extra test that will assure that my product meets these safety standards. Most of the times it's really about labeling. I find, like in my experience submitting products for safety testing, there were often things where, say we had a sharp point, like we had a sewing kit. So there was a needle and we could take out the needle, but there was also a label that we could apply that was like an 8 and up label that would allow us to keep the needle, but there just had to be a sharp point warning on the front of the box. So sometimes it's also just about informing the customer like what they're buying and who it's made for.
Absolutely. And, as someone with a special needs child, I pay close attention to labels. If there's
Oh,
things like
yeah,
button batteries, or if there's things like the fine point warning, because a lot of times the ages that are listed on the package aren't specific enough, just
yeah.
because they are not necessarily applicable to my child with special needs. I have to dive deeper and I have
Um,
to look at those individual warnings to assess if that
wow.
age range is even accurate. So, as somebody with this specific situation, which a lot of parents find themselves in, those extra labels are so, so helpful. And I always appreciate them.
Hmm.
So, one thing that you mentioned that kind of got my attention, so I kind of wanted to go back to it, if you don't
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah.
You mentioned, and again, this is something that we run into a lot with equipment, but you mentioned that there's a huge black market for these fake certifications and
Yeah.
things like that. So are there any red flags that we should be looking for that might tell us that somebody's a certificate or legitimacy is not accurate or is forged? Or are there just any
Mhm.
general red flags that you would look for in a manufacturer to say, oh, I wouldn't work with them?
Yeah. So to clarify, the black market certificates are the ISO 9001. Those are factory awarded certificates. So it's a China black market based. Um, and what we do instead of that is ask now for a business license for that factory. And what they'll do is they'll literally take a picture of the business license like up on their factory wall, and then you can kind of cross check it with the China business database, but that's for manufacturers. That's not for retail store owners. So for a retail store owner, the red flag would be if you ask somebody, has this toy been safety tested, and they look like what? That's a red flag. Then I mean, I wouldn't say completely disregard them because they just might not have a toy coach. They just might not have been told. But I would maybe have some documentation ready to say, look, I really want to support you and your brand, but I also have to protect my business. If you want to learn more about the CPSC, the toy safety certificate you need, go to this website. Here's a link. Here's some information so that you can help them, but also protect yourself. If somebody has like incomplete test reports or it looks like pages are missing, I would say that's a red flag. If you research their name on the CPSC website and you find recalls and a lot of recalls, that would also be a red flag. If a product has like if a product has like significantly lower prices than their competitor and the components look the same, that's also a red flag because usually there's a cut on labor. Maybe it's an unethical labor, or maybe it's low quality plastic or materials. So if you see a significant price dip, that's also a concern. Again, with new creators, a significant price dip could just them not knowing how to properly price their product to be profitable. So that's a different kind of concern. That might not be a bad safety issue, but it could just indicate that people are cutting corners in safety testing. So, yeah,
And one other quick question that I kind of noted, you
yeah.
mentioned Fair, which is a company that I love. I actually used to order a lot of party favors and party supplies and things
Oh,
like that through Fair. But
yeah.
one question I have is, when you order through a site like that, are those vendors pre-vetted, or are we still vetting every individual vendor, or can we trust them because they're through Fair?
That is a great question. I don't know about Fair specifically. I will have to look into it. I have set up a client on Fair and I don't remember having to put in any of her safety certifications. So that probably gives the answer right there. However, Fair is new ish. Amazon, when it first started, did not require any safety certifications at all. And now they have like the most stringent safety certifications. You have to update them like every year. You have to upload all your test reports. Like you have to have like your copyrights. It's like it's like brand protected and safety protected for kids product. So for Amazon, if you happen to find a product there, you are likely safer than for Fair. I don't know if Fair's done that yet. I would maybe reach out to somebody at Fair and find that out. Yeah, because I don't know if they have that yet.
Yeah, so I can definitely look that up, and I will update the show notes with the correct information once I locate it. If anyone is watching or listening, by the time this is published, I'll be sure I figure it out. But so are there, so it does sound like, and if I can recall correctly, when I used Fair, there are ways to reach out to individual sellers similar
There
to
are.
Etsy.
Yes.
So I'll update the show notes then with that accurate information. But I was just so curious.
Yeah.
And one more question that I had, again, I'm kind of like making notes as we go because you keep
Yeah.
bringing up great points.
Well, thank you.
One word that you mentioned that I want to go back to is recall. And you gave that example of like the moldy sand, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say we get a notice that one of our toy items from our reputable vetted vendor was recalled, and we get that information communicated to us.
Yeah.
How do you recommend we then pass that information along to our customers? And what do we need to do as retailers?
Yeah. I mean, playground owners should be transparent and proactive about communicating toy safety information. If there's a recall, I would recommend immediately notifying your consumers, whether you connect with them via email or social media or in-store notices, and you would want to date what date of product, like what purchase date of product was affected. So, I mean, it's a lot of logistics, but essentially your manufacturer who you bought the product from should be able to tell you what batch was affected. So you want to find out from them what batch was affected. You want to remove all the product, but then inform your customers any product purchased at this date is defective, should be thrown away. We just found out about a recall. We want to make sure we're protecting you and your kids. And I don't know if you come up with some sort of plan, giving a refund probably doesn't make sense for your business, but is there some other, benefit you can offer customers because you didn't know this was going to happen? Can you give them a discount the next time they come in? Can you, make the
Store
situation a little bit
credit.
better for a store credit? That would be great. Yeah. How can you improve that situation for them? I would point out like there was this major recall story. There was this brand, I don't know if you've heard of them, called Fort, and they did these magnetic Fort pillows that they launched on Kickstarter. And it's just a dad, just a regular guy, didn't have toy experience, who launched this brand. And he built the fort with magnets embedded inside. In the toy industry, we shy away from magnets because the risk associated is just not typically worth it. So if there is a magnet, it's usually going to be a higher age range product. And the magnet is going to be the core of the toy instead of like just an embedded piece of the toy. We just typically shy away from it. So this brand fort like raised $4.5 million on Kickstarter and in sales of this product. But they rushed to production because it was a Kickstarter. They rushed to production. They didn't quite know how to protect the magnets and keep them embedded in the product. So the magnets started like falling out as kids were aggressively playing with these forts. And they were very strong magnets because they had to hold together a fort, like a big pillow fort. And not obviously they had so many customers that the customers reported them. They were reported to the Better Business Bureau. They were reported to the Safety Commission. There was a huge Facebook group that was at one point lovers of this brand that turned completely the other way to being just haters of the brand because of how much the risk that they posed to the kids. So I think about that story and I think about how important it is to get out in front of your customers as soon as you know there is an issue. How important it is to not ignore suggestions from toy industry experts like, let's not do those magnets. And if we do those magnets, let's not do the strongest magnets, the rare earth magnets that are like the worst magnets that you could possibly put in a toy, and let's not put so many of them. And I mean, there's just so much to be concerned with. And if I were a retail store owner, I might have seen how successful that brand was. And I might have said, oh my gosh, that's amazing. I want to get that for my store. I want to make it an opportunity to sell that to my customers, thinking that they'd done their due diligence. But you really can't know until you see their safety certifications, until you see them a year after business, you see how they handle consumer complaints. I don't know. That story just always makes me think about why we need to just slow down in the development of our toys.
Absolutely. And I didn't know it got that deep. I do remember seeing their ads all the time on Facebook and Instagram.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's funny, they kind of just went away and I never knew the story, but that makes
Oh,
perfect sense. I didn't know that there was all that tea
so it's
related
so
to
it's so funny. I
the
had
product.
Connor, the dad, on my podcast when his Kickstarter first launched, because initially I think they launched they made 2 million. And when he came on my podcast, I started asking about the product, and he told me that there were magnets, and I was like, "Oof, why'd you do that?" I was like, "I don't think that's a good idea." But he was like, "Yeah." He said, "Everybody told us not to do magnets, but it was really the best way to make the fort." And I swear to you, those magnets were just the absolute last straw that broke the camel's back on the business. It wasn't just the magnets that caused the downfall, but those magnets were the last straw.
And it's funny because I do one-on-one consulting and I talk to a lot of indoor playground owners who say,
Yeah.
oh, we just got a residential commercial, or excuse me, we just got a residential play set and we're going to use it. Or, oh, we just, got this equipment from Alibaba and we didn't vet the manufacturer and it's been, 4 months, but we trust it's going to come. And I'm like, okay, maybe there's a reason that everybody is saying not to, or maybe there's a reason, like you said, there was such a significant price difference between
Yeah.
this vendor and other vendors.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there's a lot of congruency between those two kind of purchasing considerations. But I have those same conversations all the time where I'm like,
Yeah. No, because
that
I
might
mean,
be an issue.
it's so bad because a factory will say, yeah, 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 we can make that. And in their minds, they're looking at it visually and functionally and like, yeah, we can make that magnetic fort work. Yeah. But they're not thinking like you need like a triple stitch to secure that magnet, make sure it can't come out. They're thinking, we can't afford a triple stitch for the price they want, but we'll do a single and it'll work. And it's like, no, like that's not going to fly here. Like our
Yeah, it'll work for
customers.
a couple times.
Yeah.
But, and one thing that's so funny that you said that is so true every single time I work with a business is that kids are so much rougher than
Oh
we
my
expect they're going
gosh.
to be, especially in a commercial setting. It's one thing to have a toy item in your home and to have, it to be played with an hour a day, but for it to be
Yes.
played with all day, every day by multiple
Yes.
kids, different
Yes.
age ranges, you
Yes.
really have to be so careful. And a lot of times when people have retail toy inventory, they'll kind of put it on the floor as a way to entice people to purchase it on their way out. And
Yeah.
so, again, if they're not going through these safety standards, if they're not going through this vetting process, they're
Hmm.
double exposing themselves to risk because they're selling these items and they're also putting them on the play floor, which,
Yes.
again, is just, as we spoke about, can be a recipe for disaster. So, just to kind of wrap this up, is there anything else that we should know about this topic? I know we went into so many different things.
Yeah.
And then can you share a little bit more about the bundle that you're putting together?
Sure. I mean, the topic itself, I would say just talk to your small manufacturers. If you're working with startup toy companies, just try to talk to them. Um, if you ask them things like, "Oh, how long have you been working on this product? How'd you find your factory?" Like little conversations like that can be indicators. A toy should take a year to develop. You should not be rushing the process and the review process. When I would be developing toys when I worked full time for Toys R Us, if I got back a sample, like this happened one time. I got back a sample and the clay had mold on it. And I asked the factory, it was like a pottery wheel kit. And I asked the factory, I was like, I'm pretty sure this is mold. And they were like, oh, that's just because like it was traveling and it was like in this condition. And like, no, it's not, it's gonna be fine. And I was like, I'm gonna need you to send me another sample. And then they sent another sample, and I was like, this is definitely mold. It's like it's mold again. And that is just something that like you figure out in a year of development. And that I was like, okay, this factory is out of the running. We're not using them. For some reason, they can't package this clay with like a little enough, like they can't reduce the moisture in this clay enough that it won't mold. We cannot take that risk. That's something that took months to figure out, to verify, to test time and time again. It took months. So you talk to your startup toy manufacturers and you ask them things like that, like, how long did it take you to do this? And just get to know them. And if they're saying, oh, I developed this toy in 3 months, that's a warning sign. Like, that's not good. Um, and yeah, and I would love to tell you a little bit about the bundle. Yes.
Go ahead.
So yeah, so I decided to put together like a safety compliance bundle for retail toy store owners, and we're going to have a comprehensive toy safety standards guide. So we'll talk about the toy standards that we talked about today, a compliance checklist so that you can kind of verify the toys that you're currently carrying, and as well as a checklist to use when you're bringing in new products. I have a video about the common mistakes and how to avoid them, a vendor evaluation checklist. We get into red flags and warning signs again, and then communication strategies. So like templates, like what do you say if you do happen to have a recall, but also what do you say when you're talking to a new vendor about their product? So it's going to be a great little bundle. So you can get it at learn.thetoycoach.com/safety.
Awesome. And yeah, that sounds like it's going to be such a valuable resource, because I
Yeah.
know when you suggested this topic, I was like, oh my gosh, we have to think about that too. And I know a lot of people, when they read this episode title, when they, read our introduction or listened to our introduction, rather, they were probably like, oh gosh, one more thing. But I'm so glad that you put together a way to make this easy on us, because we have so
Yes.
much to handle, so much to think about. So I'm so glad that you've created this resource. And I
Yeah.
really appreciate you sharing your insight and expertise, and I will definitely link that for everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. And just remember, your manufacturer should do the work. They should just be giving you the receipts. Don't stress.
Perfect. So, last question, where can we follow you?
Oh, yes. Okay. So head over to thetoycoach.com to follow me. You can learn more about the toy industry from my podcast or find information about the bundle.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Bye.
All right, that wraps up my conversation with Azhelle Wade, aka the Toy Coach. Again, if you need any of the acronyms or links that she mentioned throughout this conversation, I've linked everything for easy access in the video description. And I've also linked Azhelle's website, her social media links, and this toy safety bundle that she mentioned towards the end of the episode. All right, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you learned as much as I did, because I certainly didn't know all of this. And I will see you again with another video soon. Bye for now.